Airport security screams at black man, then freezes when he flashes a federal prosecutor badge. You people never know your place, do you? The words cracked across the air like a whip, sharp enough to turn heads even in a busy terminal. Terminal C at Newark International was just waking up, coffee machines steaming and sleepy travelers yawning into their scarves. The man had done nothing, stood still in line, boarding pass in hand, suitcase quietly beside him. But his presence, his skin, his silence, they were apparently too much. The TSA officer barked again. Step aside. Now. The man didn't flinch. Tall, composed, somewhere in his late 40s. Dark wool coat over a tailored navy blue suit. Shoes polished to an obsessive shine. His left hand held the boarding pass. His right slowly dipped into the inside of his coat. Several people looked away, tension rising like steam from the linoleum floor. A white woman behind him took a small step back. A teenage boy stopped chewing his gum. But the man didn't pull a weapon. He pulled a badge. Not a police badge. Not airport clearance. Federal badge. Gold-rimmed. Real. Heavy. The badge of a United States Assistant District Attorney. And just like that, the screamer went silent. It was supposed to be an ordinary morning for Charles Boone. 6:20 a.m. flight to D.C. court appearance at 10. Closing arguments on a federal embezzlement case he'd been working for 8 months. Another day at work for one of the most respected prosecutors in the Northeastern District. He hadn't slept much. His daughter had a fever. He'd kissed her on the forehead at 4 a.m., promised he'd call from the cab. His wife had insisted she'd be fine, but he still felt the weight of walking out the door. But none of that mattered now. Not to the man in the TSA uniform who saw nothing but skin. Not to the people who heard him raise his voice and assumed something must have been done wrong. Because to some people, power is invisible unless it's wearing the right color. The badge hung in the air between them, gleaming under the fluorescence. Officer Dan Mallory-Stocky, pink-faced, crew-cut, blinked twice. Sir, Charles didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Would you like to explain? He said slowly, clearly. What probable cause you had to single me out in front of 50 people? Mallory opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His eyes darted to his supervisor, who was already walking over, lips pressed into a flat line. A manager in a TSA vest appeared, then a Port Authority officer. In seconds, the energy shifted. The crowd leaned in. Not because of the badge, not really. But because for once, the script had flipped. The man expected to bow down had drawn a line. The man expected to explain himself now waited for answers. But Charles wasn't interested in the theater. He turned to the supervisor, pulled out his ID next to the badge. I suggest you run this through your system, he said. Unless, of course, we're detaining federal prosecutors now. No, sir, the supervisor said immediately. That won't be necessary. People were filming. Phones angled subtly but intentionally. Mallory's face turned a deeper red. Charles stepped out of line. The eyes followed. But he didn't storm off. He walked with purpose toward the Admiral's Club lounge. Not because he needed rest but because he needed air. Just a moment to breathe. The worst part wasn't the shouting. It was how unsurprising it was. 30 years ago, he was just Chuck from the south side of Chicago. A kid with a single mom and a near-obsessive hunger for justice. He'd watched his older cousin get tackled by police over a broken tail light. He'd heard neighbors whisper about stop and frisks that turned violent for no reason. He'd seen the inside of a squad car by 16 not as a suspect, but as a witness, trying to explain that the kid they were pinning wasn't the one who'd thrown the rock. By 26, he'd graduated from Columbia Law. By 30, he'd turned down a 6-figure offer at a firm downtown to join the U.S. Attorney's Office. Not for the money, but for the change. But change, as he'd learned, didn't come quietly. Inside the lounge, Charles exhaled. His phone buzzed. A message from his wife. She's better. Slept through. Don't stress. You'll crush it in court. He smiled. For a moment. Then he opened Twitter. And there he was. A blurry still frame. His face serious. The TSA agent's mouth frozen mid-yell. The caption? TSA agent screams at black man at Newark. Then he flashes a federal badge. Silence. Thousands of shares already. He closed the app. The courtroom awaited. Meanwhile, back at the TSA checkpoint, Dan Mallory sat behind a closed door with a Port Authority official and a human resources representative. Sweat lined his temples. His voice was quieter now. "I didn't mean anything by it," he said. He just looked intense. Like he was hiding something. The HR rep said nothing. She simply wrote on a yellow pad. "You've had 4 complaints in the last 2 years," the Port Authority official reminded him. But he didn't say he was anybody important. "You don't need someone to flash a badge," the woman said flatly. "You need to follow the law." He didn't reply, because he knew it. He just never thought the law would be pointed back at him. In D.C., Charles stood before the bench. Calm, poised, brilliant. He won the case in 3 hours. The defendant, a hedge fund manager who drained millions from retirement accounts, was remanded immediately. Justice. Real justice. And yet, as the gavel came down, all Charles could think about was the airport. The voice, the eyes, the moment, because justice in court was his job. But justice outside? That still needed work. The flight back from D.C. that evening was quiet. Charles didn't speak much, didn't eat the snack pack they offered in first class. He stared out the oval window as the sky turned from burnt orange to black, the ground below glittering like scattered coins. He wasn't tired. He was wired. There was a pressure behind his eyes, the kind that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from emotional fatigue, the kind that builds after years of being composed, civil, measured in the face of ignorance. He'd won his case, but he felt no triumph. Instead, he kept replaying the moment in the terminal. The officer's face, the snapping tone, the familiar humiliation before the power shifted. He remembered the quiet afterward, not the absence of shouting, but the silence of complicity. Not one person had spoken up until they'd seen the badge. Not one. When he stepped through his front door that night, he was met with warmth, literal and emotional. His wife, Elena, hugged him without a word. Their daughter, Maya, already asleep upstairs, had left a crayon drawing on the counter. A stick-figure man holding a suitcase and a badge, with the words, "Daddy is a hero." He sat on the couch holding the paper, his fingers trembling ever so slightly. Elena returned with tea. She didn't speak at first, just watched him. "You're holding something back," she said finally. Charles sighed. It happened again. She didn't ask what. She already knew. "Bad. Public," he said, loud, in front of everyone. TSA officer decided I looked intense. Started yelling. Elena winced. And then, I showed him the badge. Of course. And suddenly, I was a human being. He leaned back. The story's going viral. Elena raised an eyebrow. "You posted it?" "No. Someone else. Someone filmed it." She bit her lip. "Is that good or bad?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I didn't want it to become a thing. But part of me is glad it did. Maybe people will see how easily it happens." "People will see," she said. "But they'll still ask what you did to deserve it." 2 days later, his office phone rang. It wasn't a call he expected. "Charles Boone," he answered. A gravelly voice came through. "Mr. Boone, this is Director Glenn Morrison from the Department of Homeland Security." Charles straightened in his seat. "Yes, sir. I saw the footage," Morrison said. "Frankly, I'm embarrassed. You were treated like a criminal in front of civilians, despite having done nothing but stand in line." "Thank you," Charles said, carefully neutral. "We'd like you to sit on a task force," Morrison continued. "A new review board. Internal bias in federal transportation security. We need legal oversight." There was a pause. "We need someone with your background." Charles blinked. "Is this a PR move?" "No," Morrison said. "It's long overdue. But I won't lie, your badge and your story gave it momentum. People are listening. And they should have been years ago." At the first task force meeting in D.C., Charles sat around a long rectangular table beside policy advisors, federal agents, civil rights advocates, and 2 men from the TSA's legal department. They were reviewing body cam footage from other incidents, most of which had never reached the public eye. A young black woman detained because her ID photo didn't match her appearance after growing out her hair. A Muslim man pulled into secondary screening because of his tone. A Latino teenager told he needed extra screening because of heightened alerts. No alerts existed. Charles watched the footage in silence. One clip made his jaw clench. A young boy no older than 8 was separated from his parents for a full 30 minutes without explanation. His crime? He wore a hoodie and looked older. A TSA agent in the video muttered, "He didn't look 8. The room was silent. Then Charles spoke. "We keep acting like these are exceptions," he said. "But they're not. They're patterns. Predictable ones." The others nodded. One civil rights lawyer, a woman named Amara, leaned in. "And when someone with power like you experiences it, the country gasps. But when someone poor, someone undocumented, someone voiceless goes through it, the country blinks and moves on." She wasn't angry, just tired. "I want to do more than investigate," Charles said. "I want change, policy, accountability." And for the first time in a long time, the room agreed with him. The task force work was grueling. Testimonies, data reviews, statistical analysis of racial profiling reports, policy loopholes. And through it all, Charles kept receiving messages. From strangers. "Thank you for standing up. My son went through the same thing. Seeing someone who looks like me hold that badge made me cry. But also, you people always play the race card. Bet you got your job because of a quota. Just follow the rules and you won't have problems." Some messages he deleted. Others he saved. The worst one came on a Sunday evening. An anonymous email with one sentence. "Next time, the badge won't save you." He filed a report. Security was notified. Nothing came of it. Still, he changed his routine. He stopped traveling alone. He began carrying a second eye just in case. He gave a short talk at Maya's school about fairness and respect. Someone reported him for getting political. The school stood by him, but the moment stayed with him. Because he wasn't trying to make waves. He was trying to survive the water. One night, Charles met Amara for coffee. She was 6 years into her nonprofit work. Burned out, but relentless. They sat at a quiet table in the back, their cups growing cold as conversation deepened. "Sometimes I wonder," he admitted, "if I'm doing this for me or for the people I couldn't protect." She studied him. "Does it matter?" "I guess not." He looked at her. "Do you ever feel like you're screaming into a void?" "All the time," she said. "But sometimes, someone hears you." She smiled. "You screamed back at a system that wasn't ready for you. That matters." Weeks passed. More meetings. More reports. And then a call from Morrison again. "Charles, we're drafting new language into TSA training protocols. Bias recognition. Mandatory annual reviews. Randomized supervisor audits." Charles exhaled. "Finally." "And your story?" Morrison asked. It was more than a headline. It was a turning point. Charles didn't feel victorious. He felt responsible. The badge that had once just been his job had become something else. A shield, yes, but also a mirror, because it didn't change who he was. It only changed how others saw him. And that, Charles realized, was the problem all along. "Let me know when you're ready for the next 2,000 words. 2 months after the task force began its work, Charles Boone walked into Newark Airport again. Same terminal, same checkpoint, but everything felt different. The TSA checkpoint had new signage visible now, printed in bold letters. "Respect is mandatory. Profiling is prohibited. If you see something, say something including bias." He stood in line, briefcase in hand, dressed in a charcoal suit and a burgundy tie, the same steady calm in his posture. But inside he was bracing. He scanned the faces of the TSA officers, noting the name badges. None of them were Mallory. In fact, he hadn't seen Officer Mallory since that morning. A quiet voice at the podium greeted him. "Good morning, sir. May I see your ID?" Charles handed it over. The officer looked at it, then back at him, then said with a smile, "Appreciate the work you've been doing, Mr. Boone." Charles blinked. The officer leaned in a little, lowering his voice. "We've all had to sit through new training modules. They used your case. It opened a lot of eyes." Charles gave a small nod. "Glad to hear it." The line moved forward. He made it through security in less than 3 minutes. No raised voices. No suspicion. No confrontation. For the first time in a long time, it felt normal. But the moment lingered. Was this progress? Or just a brief calm before another storm? Meanwhile, at a small station inside the administrative wing of the airport, Officer Dan Mallory sat in a windowless office. He hadn't worn a TSA badge in weeks. After multiple complaints and a thorough investigation, he had been reassigned pending a final decision. His lawyer had fought to retain his pension. He would not face criminal charges, but his career in airport security was effectively over. At his desk sat a termination letter, and signed. But what weighed heavier was the envelope beneath a handwritten letter from someone he didn't expect. It read, "Mr. Mallory, you likely don't remember me beyond the moment you screamed at me. But I remember you. I remember your voice, your expression, the way you assumed my presence was a threat. I also remember not retaliating. Not because I was weak, but because I was exhausted. And because I knew the law better than you did. I don't write this letter to mock you. I write it in the hope that you reflect. You have power, or had it. You misused it. But you can still choose how you use the rest of your life. I hope you use it for something better. CB." Mallory folded the letter and stared at the wall. He didn't reply, but for once he sat in silence. The task force's work expanded. Charles was asked to consult on broader issues: racial bias in immigration interviews, disparities in customs enforcement, surveillance practices in urban airports. It was exhausting, but he kept showing up. At night, he tucked Maya into bed, reading her stories about courage and kindness. She asked questions now. Hard ones. "Why did that man yell at you, Daddy?" "Because he saw me differently," Charles said. "Did you yell back?" "No," he said. "I showed him who I was." "Did he say sorry?" "No, sweetheart. But that's okay. Sometimes, we don't need an apology to move forward." Maya was quiet for a long moment. "Did it make you sad?" "Yes." She hugged him. "I don't want people to be mean to you." "I don't want them to be mean to anyone," Charles said. In June, Charles was invited to give a commencement speech at Howard University's law school. He stood on the stage, looking out at hundreds of young graduates, many of them black, brown, first generation. He didn't use notes. He just spoke. "I don't stand here as a hero," he said. "I stand here as a reminder of what happens when you're told, again and again, that your skin is a red flag, when your presence is seen as a threat before your words are heard, when your credentials only matter after you're humiliated." He paused. "You've worked hard. You've earned your seats. But remember this: your value is not in your resume. It's in your presence, in how you make space, hold space, and protect others who never got the chance." The audience was silent, and then roaring with applause. The following week, a new incident broke the news. An elderly black man was pulled from a Delta gate in Atlanta after being mistaken for agitated. He'd been anxious about flying alone for the first time in 20 years. Charles saw the footage, heard the same tone, the same dismissive authority. But this time, something changed. The flight crew apologized publicly. TSA issued a statement. The agents involved were removed pending review. And Charles knew the system wasn't fixed, but the culture was shifting. A little. Enough. He met Amara again for lunch. She brought a small folder of press clippings. "You're becoming the face of federal dignity," she joked. He rolled his eyes. "Don't remind me." "Seriously," she said. "You've moved the needle. Not all the way, but further than most." She opened the folder and passed him a photo. It was from Newark. A young black TSA officer, standing next to a cardboard display that read, "Bias stops with me," and beneath it, in small print, "Inspired by the actions of ADA Charles Boone." Charles stared at it. His throat tightened. That night, as he lay in bed, Elena beside him asleep, he stared at the ceiling. He thought of the airport, of the badge, of the silence that had followed the shout. He thought of all the people who couldn't flash anything but pain. And he made a vow. He would never stop showing up. Not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been screamed at for simply existing. 3 years had passed. The air was different now. Not completely clean. Bias doesn't vanish with time, but thinner. Lighter in places where it used to suffocate. Charles Boone, now a senior federal prosecutor, walked through Dulles International Airport with a quiet sense of familiarity. He had become a recognizable figure, not a celebrity, but a symbol. People didn't rush him for selfies. They simply nodded, respectfully, sometimes gratefully. He passed security without incident. No one shouted. No one stared. A young officer even offered him a smile and said, "Thank you, sir, for everything you do." He gave a small smile back. "Just doing my job." But Charles knew his job had evolved. It wasn't just courtrooms and indictments anymore. It was advocacy. It was mentorship. It was change. And it had cost him. He remembered the nights Elena would find him sitting in the dark, staring at footage of yet another wrongful stop, another child in tears, another family humiliated. He never got used to it. He never wanted to, because numbness, he feared, was the first step toward complicity. At the Justice Department's annual Civil Rights Summit, Charles gave the closing keynote. The room was filled with federal judges, prosecutors, activists, and law students. He didn't begin with a victory. He began with a story. 3 years ago, he said, I was shouted at in an airport by a man who didn't know me. He didn't care what I did for a living, or who I was to my daughter, or what I'd done for this country. He just saw what he'd been trained to fear. He paused. And I forgive him. The room was still. I forgave him, Charles continued. Not because I excused what he did, but because holding that anger was never my justice to carry. Real justice, lasting justice, doesn't come from shame. It comes from change. He looked out at the crowd. You can't legislate empathy, but you can build systems that reward it. And then he said something that wasn't in the speech he wrote. If you're in this room, you have power. Power to protect, to prevent, to make others feel safe in spaces where they've always been made to feel small. Don't waste it. Applause thundered like rain on a tin roof. Back home that evening, Maya, now 10, was waiting up with a school project spread out on the dining table. She looked up as Charles entered. Daddy, I need help. I'm doing a report on someone who changed the country. Charles took off his coat. Do you need someone famous? Or someone important? Maya tilted her head. Aren't those the same? He smiled. Not always. She thought for a moment. Okay, I pick you. He blinked. Me? She nodded. Because you made them stop yelling at people like us. You said something when everyone else didn't. He sat down beside her, eyes misting slightly. But baby, he said, I didn't change the country. Maya reached for his hand. Well, she said, you changed it for me. That night, as Charles stood at the window, watching city lights flicker like fireflies, he thought about legacy. Not the kind etched in law books or framed certificates, but the kind whispered in classrooms, passed from parent to child, reflected in the quiet dignity of being seen. He'd faced down a system that wanted to shrink him, and when it tried, he didn't lash out. He stood firm, not just with a badge, but with his presence, his story, his truth. He thought of all the people who didn't get to hold up a badge, who couldn't demand silence with authority but who deserved every bit of respect he did. That's why he kept going. That's why he still would. One morning, 2 years later, long after the story had faded from headlines, Charles was in a coffee shop near the courthouse when a man approached his table. Late 50s, gray hair, nervous. Excuse me, the man said. Are you Charles Boone? Charles nodded cautiously. Yes. The man sat without asking. I was Officer Dan Mallory. Silence passed like a gust of wind. I don't expect you to talk to me, Mallory said quickly. I just wanted to say, I read your letter. Every word. Charles said nothing. I lost my badge, Mallory continued. Rightfully. I was angry at first. Thought you ruined my life. But I get it now. His voice cracked. I've been volunteering at a youth shelter. Most of the kids are black or brown. And every time I look at them, I remember how I looked at you that day. How wrong I was. Charles studied him. Why are you telling me this? Mallory hesitated. Because I need to say it. And because I think maybe, if people like me can change, then your work wasn't in vain. Charles leaned back. He still didn't smile, but he nodded slowly. Then make sure you keep changing, he said. I will. The man stood, quietly left, and Charles sat for a long time, staring at the steam rising from his coffee. Years later, Charles Boone's name would appear in footnotes of law reviews, government policy archives, and civil rights case studies. But more importantly, it would appear in the stories young public defenders told in courtrooms. It would appear in how security guards spoke with less suspicion. It would echo in how flight attendants intervened when profiling happened midair. And in the quiet voice of a black child one day, waiting in line at an airport, telling their parent, "It's okay. He looks kind." The end.